am personally close to coming to a conclusion, and I may or may not tell you guys about that later. But this is the most important thing that I have learned. I have become someone who will agree with whatever the evidence points towards. So I started out a Christian, and then I stepped back from that and said, no matter what my preconceptions were, whatever the evidence points towards, whether it be Mormonism, whether it be Islam, whether it be Christianity, atheism, deism, agnosticism, Sikhism, Taoism, Taoism, Buddhism, Hinduism, whatever you want, if the evidence points towards it, I will believe it. All right, so now I want to show you guys my process. In order to figure out whether or not God exists, first we have to figure out whether or not we exist. We also have to figure out whether or not we can know anything. So this led me to the most fundamental types of knowledge, namely, can we know that we exist? Okay, that's one thing. This led me to French philosopher René Descartes, who said, I think, therefore I am. I'm seeing stuff, I'm thinking things. That doesn't necessarily mean that the outside world exists, but it does mean that whatever it is that I am perceiving about the world exists and my thoughts exist. So here is one fundamental thing that I know. Something else that I came across was the general reliability of senses. I didn't say absolute reliability of senses because we can actually use our senses to figure out that some of our senses aren't completely reliable. So that's one fundamental assumption. And then, hope that's not on the way, logic. Logic is another fundamental thing that is true. Now, how do we know that these are true? Ultimately, if we're going to know anything, we have to make a circular assumption at some point. For example, people will usually get really frustrated when someone uses a circular argument for God's existence. I'm sure all of you have been annoyed by that in the past. But consider this. How do we know logic is viable? Logic is viable because that seems logical. So ultimately, you're going to have to use circular logic to know anything at all. But not all types of circular logic, I think, were created equal, pun not intended. Certain ones, for example, fundamentally assuming that if I eat 1,000 pieces of bacon, I will experience paradise when I die, I could fundamentally assume that. And that would be just as valid as my fundamental assumption of senses. However, that one is not very useful. The same is true for fundamentally assuming something like Allah is the one true God and Muhammad is his prophet. Fundamentally assuming that means that I will agree with Islam, and even if evidence is presented counter to that to me, I will find a way around that evidence because evidence doesn't apply to circular assumptions. So I pick these. I'm cheating. This is just as bad as those other ones, so I'm admitting it. I messed up, but I don't think anyone else can do any better than this, and I'm picking these simply for practical reasons because I would bet my life on these things. I bet my life on my existence. I bet my life on my senses. Truck is coming towards me. I see it with my eyes. Do I stop and say, well, are my eyes reliable? And then I start to question my logic. If truck hits Josh, then Josh will die. Well, is logic actually viable? No, I'll get out of the way. So I'm basing my entire philosophy off of things that I would bet my life off of. So obviously you bet your life on existence, you bet your life on senses, and you bet your life on logic, because ultimately that's what we're doing, is betting our lives. If there's some sort of higher being that cares whether or not we believe in him or something like that, and whether or not we end up in heaven or hell is contingent upon whether or not we have such a belief, it's totally worth it to figure it out because we're betting our lives on it, possibly for eternity. Not saying that I agree with or disagree with anything right now. I'm just saying that it's possible and it's probably worth it to know. And even if we find out that there is no God, we'll find out a lot of cool stuff about the universe along the way. Okay, so these three things are what I like to call the roots of a tree of knowledge, because they are the most fundamental things that we can know. Okay. And then our tree is going to build up. Okay. I'm also a plant biologist, so I know how to draw trees. All right, so those are our fundamental assumptions. And the other thing that falls down here is the age-old debate between realism, anti-realism, and one other mystery thing that I will introduce in a second. Could we maybe dim the lights a little bit? So basically, the easiest way to think about realism and anti-realism is to think about the matrix. Anti-realism would say, okay, let's start with realism. Realism is easy. Realism is probably what most of us assume. And all it is that we're actually all here in a room. All of us actually exist. All of us have minds. We're all people. We're actually people. And basically, everything is actually real. Anti-realism is we don't actually have any way of knowing whether or not everything is real. Like, if we were in a matrix, this wouldn't be real. It would all just be information being fed into our minds, or possibly only my mind, because you guys all might just be figments of my imagination. So basically in the matrix, that would be an anti-realist scenario. People think that they exist, but really, they're just in a giant computer. And so we have Morpheus here saying, what will it be, red or blue pill? You're going to find out what's really real. And Neo responds, what if the world outside of the matrix is actually a secondary matrix designed to deceive us into thinking we can escape? Trinity responds, hold on a sec. Why couldn't the world outside of that matrix also just be another matrix to be extra tricky? You know, in case any perceptive SSS students figure out that the secondary matrix is real. Okay, and then we have Morpheus speechless. Thought he was pretty cool. And then we have Stephen Hawking. Model-dependent realism. Okay, so we can turn the lights back on now. This is what I have found to be the most intellectually satisfying alternative to both realism and anti-realism, because there's no way to disprove anti-realism. There's no way. Realism, we really want to believe it because, well, we like to think that all of our loved ones exist and the world exists. But what Stephen Hawking just introduced for us was model-dependent realism. All right, so this is, I'm going to just say MDR. Now, in model-dependent realism, we don't know whether or not the world actually exists. So we're starting out there. But then, we're going to say, who cares about that? The world is somewhat consistent, and we can use these three things to describe the world. Once we have these three things, logic, senses, and existence, then we can get things like math. And once we have math, we can get science. And also, once we have these things, we can get other types of philosophy. Okay. Now, as any scientist in the room will know, if we use our skills of observation, our logic, our science, and our math, we can write equations to describe the world. Now, those observations and descriptions, if we get enough of them and they're powerful enough, they'll become a scientific theory. And those theories about this world, whatever it is, we don't know whether or not it exists, are consistent, and for the purposes of practicality, are consistent. And so we can use them. For an example, I hope this is making sense. If we had, say, a goldfish, I'm also a marine biologist, so I know how to draw fish. If we have a fish in, okay, and the reason we really started thinking about this kind of thing is because we used to think that the universe was, say, 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time, and then we found out later that the universe isn't like a pure flat grid. Actually, mass can bend space and time, And so we're not in like a flat universe, we're actually in a curvy universe. So that's where this example was inspired. This goldfish is in a spherical tank. And if he was going to look at, say, a ball flying past, he would not see that ball going in a straight line. He would see it going in a curved line. Now us on the outside, we see that it's going in a straight line. So who's right, us or the goldfish? Based off of model-dependent realism, both are right, because based off of the goldfish's model and his set of descriptions of the universe in which he exists are consistent for all objects that follow that trajectory. So he can define it, and it's going to be consistent, and it's useful to him, and it's practical. And because it's practical, it falls within my previously established frame of mind. So who's right? Both of us are right. We can use